Thank you, Anne. Isn't it interesting to have that conversation about the fallout from last year when we kind of was wondering what was going on? So it's interesting to reflect on that. It was all over the media, and then it was also not over the media, wasn't it, the swine flu? So thank you very much, Anne. Our next speaker tonight, not many people can come to this stage of their life, their 20s I think, and say that they have discovered 13 new parasites. And our next speaker has just done that. She's discovered 10 new types of nematodes and two or three species of lice. So there you go. Our next speaker is Dr. Hayley Weaver. She's a parasitologist at the Australian National University in Canberra. This is a woman you do actually want to be cornered by at a party. What she knows about parasites amazed me. And she started out doing her PhD looking at parasites on a native rodent, on desert rats. But now she's turned her attention to humans, although I have to say, watching the election coverage in the lead up to Saturday, I'm wondering whether there is much of a difference between desert rats and humans. Let's give Hayley Weaver a warm welcome.
Thanks, Natasha. Hi, everyone. Before I start, I want to thank the ICOPA Outreach Committee and Jeff Taylor from the City of Melbourne for inviting me here tonight. It's great to be here. I'm actually a Melbourne girl, although I haven't lived here for quite a while, so it's really good to be able to come back and talk to you all about parasites because I'm making a living out of parasites, so I want to share it with you. When I got the invitation, I sort of thought, well, why on earth... people might wonder what the link is between parasitism and climate change. Let's face it, parasites aren't really the kind of thing that you talk about over the dinner table, although, because we've got nearly 2,000 parasitologists in Melbourne right now, we're quite happy to talk about worms over dinner. But it's not really something that you generally talk about, and I'm sure that my mum, who is in here somewhere, still scratches her head sometimes and wondering why on earth her daughter chose to cut out worms out of rats for a living, but, it's working for me. So because I have that background in wildlife parasitology, I'm very much aware of the fact that there is a relationship between the hosts and the parasites. And climate has an effect on that because, when we talk about parasites, we often talk about the things inside the hosts, but many parasites also have an external aspect as well. They have a part of their life cycle that is outside a host, either waiting for a host or looking for an appropriate area to wait. So there is a direct link between that external area and climate change and what effects climate change may exert on the environment. There's also an indirect effect because the host, whether it's a person or an animal, will all be affected by climate change in the same way. So you've got the actual effect on the host and the effect on the parasite. So there's quite a link there between parasites and climate change. It makes so much sense when you sit and think about it for a minute. Because climate will be changing, there will be temperature changes, there will be precipitation changes, there will be extreme weather events based on the perturbation of the climate. There's going to be a lot of movement of people and of animals, and all these things are potentially hosts of parasites. So we need to sort of get our head around the fact that there are going to be movements of people and movements of animals and how that will affect the parasites. So what I wanted to talk about today was a group of parasites that infect humans that haven't been touched on yet, which is nice because I hadn't squared this off with my co-presenters, so it's nice that they haven't mentioned them yet. But they're called soil-transmitted helminths, and they're a group of, there's 4 nematodes. They're unsegmented roundworms. There are 2 species of hookworm called Ancylostoma duodenale and Nicator americanus, and another worm called Ascaris lumbricoides, and a 4th worm called Trichuris trichiura. And these infect people, and they infect people in the tropical and subtropical parts of the world, and until quite recently infected some people in Australia, mainly Aboriginal populations. And another important thing to note about these worms is that they infect poor people. It's not the rich people in these subtropical and tropical areas that get affected by these worms, it's the poor people. The poorest billion people in the world are the ones that have the worms, so that's an important point to make. These have a direct host life cycle, which means that they live in humans exclusively, but they have an aspect of their life cycle that involves being out in the environment. So basically the way these worms operate is that they live in the small intestine of the human, in the gut, and they are adults in there, and they shed eggs in the small intestine, and these essentially get pooped out when the host goes to the toilet. So you have eggs that are out in the environment for Ascaris and Trichuris, that's the infective stage, and people acquire infection by these worms by actually going out and picking them up off the ground, and it doesn't normally not done directly. Night soil is a great example of how in Southeast Asia and in China these worms are, the infection is continued in the population because the toilet buckets are taken out on to fertilise the crops, and then the crops are then brought in and eaten, usually without being washed first. So that's how the infection gets perpetuated in humans. Hookworms, it's a little different. The hookworm is passed in the same way. The egg is out in the environment, but the egg hatches. And then the little baby worm, the larva, goes through a couple of molting stages, and at its third molt, it becomes an infective larva. And it can be ingested in the same way, through picking it up off the ground and eating it indirectly through food or other things. Or it can also, you can go outside with your bare foot and step on the ground, and the larva will penetrate your skin and through various mechanisms end up in your small intestine as an adult. So that's how that infection is perpetuated. So we have this interaction here between the climate and the hosts, and we have the hypothetical proposed interaction between climate change and the hosts. So what we want to understand is what are the likely climate change effects on the actual environment. If the hookworms need a particular set of environmental parameters to survive and climate change alters that, will that change the distribution of those worms? Will populations be affected where they weren't previously? Or will perhaps the movement of people who had the worms to a particular area where worms can survive but aren't already, will that cause an infection being sustained in that region? So I think that's an important point that we might unpack a little later. How will the movements of people, if people are being affected indirectly by climate change through perhaps food availability and agriculture, they can't live in a particular area, they are forced to move elsewhere, then they may take those worms with them. So, where's my notes? The other thing to note is that regardless of whether climate change is going to be happening or not, we have a population, a global population that is increasing so much, and in the next few years we're going to end up with more people than ever in the world, and we're going to have to feed them and look after them, and everything's going to have to be able to work together. But if we can't get on top of these helminth infections now, how will the added effect of climate change complicate matters? If we already don't have that equity available for the poorest of the poor to access solutions and control methods for their helminth infections, how will climate change further complicate that? And I think that I'll leave with that big question. Thank you.
Can't wait to unpack that question. Thank you, Hayley. Terrific detail too. A woman passionate about parasites. So lots to discuss there, and we will be coming to all of you for questions as part of the discussion as well. So get those questions in mind. Our next guest is one of the superstars of international parasitology. He features in a colleague of mine, Carl Zimmer, who's a fantastic and brilliant science writer, in a book by Carl called Parasite Rex, I think it is, isn't it? And I urge you to read Carl's book. But Kevin Lafferty is from the University of California, Santa Barbara. He works for the US Geological Survey and studies the ecology of infectious disease, working mainly on marine systems, and I gather he's an obsessive scuba diver, and with his wife runs a nature reserve or two. I envy his life. But he also studies human diseases such as toxoplasmosis and schistosomiasis, and he's about to put a spanner in the works of this conversation, I suspect. He's at the centre of a very hearty debate in science about whether we can really say increasing temperatures will increase the burden of infectious disease and parasites. Thank you.
Firstly, I wanted to say it's been quite lovely to be here in Victoria. It's my first visit to the state and this very charming city. It's been a wonderful visit so far. I'm an ecologist, and what that means is that I study the distribution and abundance of various organisms. And early in my career, I became particularly fascinated by how parasites and infectious diseases fit into biodiversity in general. In fact, it seems pretty clear that for all the species that we know as free-living species, there's at least one parasite species in the world, and so probably the majority of biodiversity is parasitic, not free-living. I'm making this point because if we were to be having this discussion, this conversation, and we were going to be talking about climate change and biodiversity, let me ask the audience, what would the message be from conservation biologists? What's going to happen to biodiversity? What's the projection? Can anybody give me a suggestion? So the estimates from my colleagues in conservation biology is we should expect to see somewhere between a 12 and 40% reduction in biodiversity according to some climate change scenarios. That's really sobering to think about. And so I'm going to explain to you why, what's the rationale behind this. Well, every organism has a temperature optimum. Too cold is not so great. Too warm is not so great. And organisms generally adapt to the particular habitats where they've evolved and speciated. As you shift climate, and we've certainly seen this throughout the history of our globe, climate has been changing on geological scales all the time. That makes the climate suitability for a particular organism in a particular location shift. And when we're talking about climate warming, we're talking about shifting towards higher latitudes. Okay? So what the conservation biologists are concerned about is that organisms that are adapted to a particular place are going to find themselves not so well adapted as the climate changes. And if they're going to persist over a long period of time, they're going to have to be able to move to the locations where the climate is similar to what they've evolved to survive in. Or they'll have to evolve and adapt to the new climate. The thought is that these new locations are not necessarily going to be suitable for the other types of environmental factors that these species need. There might not be the right soil type, there might not be the right pollinators, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so that's how the conservation biologists look at climate change. The infectious disease biologists tend to look at it differently. Essentially, the message that we are generally concerned about is that infectious diseases are going to increase with climate change. And I'm going to tell you that that's also true. In some cases, infectious diseases are going to increase in climate change, and in many cases we're going to see reductions in biodiversity with climate change, and yet those are difficult to reconcile, because infectious diseases and parasites don't necessarily play by different rules than the rest of biodiversity. Okay? So what I'd like to do is walk you through what I consider the challenge for the scientists in my generation, which is to posit that the effect of climate change on biodiversity in general, and infectious diseases specifically, is really one of the grand challenges for my discipline, ecology. But there are some simple and I think fairly straightforward and easy to understand principles behind it. So if you take, for instance, malaria. Malaria is the sort of the poster child of the type of infectious disease that we need to be worried about. We know that falciparum malaria, for instance, has a temperature optimum sort of in the mid-30s, sort of 30 to 25 degrees centigrade. Too hot's not good for malaria, and too cold is not good for malaria. If we take that hump-shaped curve, that hump-shaped response surface of malaria, and we apply it to a climate change scenario, we can build a map that shows the present distribution of malaria, and then we can ask what might happen to the future. And many scientists have done this, and the research is getting better and better all the time, and we've done it not just for malaria, but for many other types of infectious diseases and their vectors. But generally the pattern is very similar. What we see is that the climate suitability for malaria is going to shift to higher latitudes. Okay? The surface of the globe that's going to be suitable for malaria will not necessarily, as far as we can tell, experience a net increase. It's just that different parts of the globe are going to be suitable for malaria than they are now. I want to point out a couple of caveats that are important. If you live in the Sahel right now, the area around the Senegal River, for example, it's presently pretty suitable for malaria. Okay? Climate change is going to make your average temperature go up, and it's going to be, for the most part, too hot and too dry for malaria to do well there. Perhaps good news, if you're like some of my friends in Senegal who have all had malaria several times as children. But bad news in the sense of the other sorts of disruptive effects that being really hot and dry is going to have on your society. So I'm not implying that climate change that reduces infectious disease is necessarily a net gain for the societies in those locations. But the bottom line is that, at least for malaria and many other infectious diseases, what we expect to see are shifts in the climate suitability. Okay? What's also interesting about the shifts is that because wealthier societies tend to be at higher latitudes, we're going to be shifting climate suitability for tropical diseases into countries that have more resources to deal with them. And let me backtrack a minute about the importance of considering economics and other covariates when trying to predict what's going to happen to the distribution of infectious diseases in the future. In Chaucer's England, we have lots of records of malaria. Britain was a malarious place then. Okay? And if we, some very clever biologists looked at the changes in malaria reports from year to year, and they asked what were the factors that were responsible for years with lots of malaria and years with very little malaria. And they put precipitation and climate into their statistical models. And it's one of the things that they found was that warmer, wetter years were better for malaria in England than cold, dry years, which is exactly what you would expect because we know malaria and the vectors that transmit it are very sensitive to climate. But when they added in two other variables, which is the amount of wetland habitat and the number of cattle in England, what they found is that those environmental effects explained far more, the vast majority of the variation in malaria. So if you wanted to know whether you're going to have a lot of malaria in a particular year in England, what really counted was not so much the climate, but the wetland destruction and the number of cattle. The number of cattle perhaps because if mosquitoes are biting cattle instead of people, that dilutes the transmission efficiency. The reason I'm bringing up this point is that, again, the countries that are likely to see the increases in tropical diseases are also the ones that have at their disposal the sorts of resources where they're going to be able to deal with this threat better. And I think that's one bit of good news in this story. Okay, but someone asked me when we had the recent economic meltdown, we were having a discussion about climate change and malaria, and they said, you know, are you worried that infectious disease is going to increase? And I said, I am really worried that infectious disease is going to increase, but not so much because of climate change. These disruptive economic meltdowns, if they are to be part of our future, are really likely to happen much more rapidly and have much more dramatic consequences for infectious disease. And I'll give you an example. Has anybody heard of the great malaria epidemics in Poland? Okay. Post-World War II, Poland was in complete disarray. It lost much of its social infrastructure. The climate hadn't changed, but they suffered a number of years of pretty serious malaria outbreaks. And this is the sort of thing that I think that is likely to be the real big story, not so much climate. But again, what people will, I think what we need to be concerned about, and maybe even the biggest effect of climate, if climate is going to do things like disrupt agriculture and lead to mass migrations and movements of people, those are going to be large-scale economic and social disruptions. They're going to be on par, perhaps, with World War-type events. If that's the case, then those things are certainly likely to have an effect on increasing infectious disease. There's no question about that. So those are the sorts of, I would say, perhaps alternative views about how climate may interact with infectious disease, which I think are important to consider, at least for me as a researcher, because my job is not necessarily to explain or to market why we should be afraid of climate change, although there's many reasons that we should, but to try to understand how climate and other aspects of environmental change are likely to affect infectious diseases. And to do a good job of that, I think we need to keep all of these other factors in mind. Thank you very much.